What's good, YouTube? Steel here, and we're just about 2 weeks into the Shining Revelry format, and I believe it's safe to say that it's like the most diverse format that Pokemon Pocket has seen to this date. And in this video, we're going to take a deep dive into the largest tournament that happened over the weekend, as we saw 10 decks have a more than 3% play rate. And I truly believe that the metagame of this tournament is a good representation of where the format is currently, as well as give you a good idea of what you're going to see on the ranked ladder. But before we get into it, if y'all enjoy videos like these where we break down the entire meta or all things Pokemon Pocket, please consider liking and subscribing, as we do a little bit of everything on this channel. And above all else, stay pro. As y'all can see, we're probably looking at the most diverse chart that I've ever had to put together for one of these meta reports. And although there's always like a boatload of different decks like in the other pile, like a bunch of like one-off decks, this is like the first time that we've seen so many decks have like significant play. And in this case, it was like more than 3%. Most of the times in the charts, I would have to like extend to like any deck that was played 2.5 in order to see more pictures, especially in like past formats where like RCS and Repardos were just taking over. As we look at the metagame shift under, we can see that the top 5 decks in terms of play rate have changed quite a bit from like the past weekend, as we see exponential rises from both like the Mewtwo Giratina list and the Meowscarada. And Meowscarada is like the Beedrill list specifically. Mewtwo was to be expected because not only did it win the previous week, it also had like great win rates across the table, winning I think almost like 60%, which I don't think is sustainable. And as we look into the stats, it wasn't. But I guess the surprise factor, along with it actually being like a very strong deck, made it do really good numbers last week. And then this week, it doesn't have bad numbers by any means, but it wasn't like as like drastically like overpowering. And when we're talking about Meowscarada, I was actually more surprised because last week, and when I mean last week is like the Ursi Day, these metagame videos, I try to make them like weekly. And the 22, the weekly for number 22, there was only one player that like signed up with the Meowscarada Beedrill version. And this week we had like 6% of players play, making it the 5th most used deck, which going from one person to the 5th most is kind of crazy, but for good reason, as the deck is very strong and it puts like a lot of checks on the top of the meta, although it has some like weird matchups here and there. But again, seeing a deck like that come out of nowhere essentially and do so well is like always like pretty cool. Then looking at the top spot, despite like a slight drop in like in total percentage, as you see, it goes from like about 20% to a 15%. It was still the most played deck. For the most part, they opted to cut out Druddigon, and the RCS version didn't really like pick up. So essentially, they're only playing 4 Pokemon, the 2 Giratinas and the 2 Darkrai's. But I'm pretty sure most of y'all know what this deck is doing or how good it is. Regardless, we'll look into a list for it. And then after its top 4 finish, we actually see Charizard see an increase in play rate as well. As you see, it went from like 3% of the player pool to 6.4, basically doubling its play rate. However, the fact that it did finish top 4 makes sense as why it saw play rate. If you were to look at the numbers like from my past meta report, it would indicate that those stats were like very hard to replicate, as it had terrible like win rates across the board. It was almost like, it was actually, no, it wasn't almost, it was literally one guy that had like a good run and made the deck look great. But if you look at all throughout the entire like tournament, the win rates for Charizard were brutal. And it kind of reflects, as we'll look later into it, how it didn't really make it into top cut, nor did it have much success. And finally, rounding up the top 5, we see Gyarados basically stand in the same spot. It had 10% last week, it has 10% this week. And personally, I think one of 2 things is going to happen, as either Gyarados is going to take off and see a lot more play because it's currently one of the strongest decks and has such good matchups throughout the table, or we're going to see an uptick on fighting decks, whether it's Rampardos using Hitmonlee or Gallade, which is has been the counter to this point, as decks try to like take advantage of like the rising Gyarados by rising in like fighting decks, and we'll see Gyarados actually like fall off. But most likely, with or without the increase of like the use of Hitmonlee, I believe Gyarados is going to continue to see not only like success, but even like more play rate, if that makes sense. And as far as all these stats that I say about win rate and how good they're doing against certain matchups or whatever, we will get into it once I look into like the individual list of the decks that topped and did well, or any decks that I feel like I want to point out. I'll go into like their matchups and how they did against like the top decks in the format. Now looking further down the pie chart, we can see that quite a few decks have truly like fallen off. Starting with Gallade, that although it's the 6th most played deck, it was the 2nd most just a week ago, and its play rate has fallen off by more than half, as it went from 13% to like about 6%. But like I mentioned just now with Gyarados, there could be an uptick in like how many people are playing Gallade. However, if you've played it in ranked or been either or whether you're playing Gyarados or you've been playing Gallade, you've noticed that the Gyarados player tends to just now start with your Magikarp when they see that you're on fighting. And unfortunately, some of the time, if not most of the time, that like completely counters what Gallade can do to a Gyarados deck, especially if you already have the Gyarados in hand. Like, you just start Magikarp, their Hitmonlee can't touch it, none of their Pokemon can touch it, and then they just evolve, and you're like looking at a Gyarados that eventually will start like wiping your board. And you better find like Gallade fast in that instance. If Gyarados rises as I'm predicting, It will bring also the rise of Gallade and fighting decks in general. It also caught my eye how the mighty have fallen, as we see Dialga, Arceus, and Rampardos continue to fall, as 2 weeks ago they were the top decks, making up a third of the entire format, and now both of them are barely like reaching 3% of play rate. Although I can honestly see like the right combination of cards as well as some luck could bring Rampardos back up to like being like relevant or seeing more play or doing very good in the tournament. However, I truly believe that the Dialga Arceus has completely fallen out of favor, and its timing like at the top, at least for now, has like completely closed. As similar to Charizard, it did finish top 4 like the week prior, but all the numbers pointed towards a regression where like it was going to be very hard to replicate that performance. And the last deck I wanted to talk about was 18 Trainer. Although it wasn't among the decks that made more than 3%, it kind of caught my eye how it completely fell off. I'm assuming it's because whoever was playing 18 Trainer just shifted towards the 17 Trainer with the Giratina and the Mewtwo. But it completely fell off. Whether it's Articuno, Palkia, like it just didn't see any play this week. And honestly, none of the few that played actually did anything. So I don't see 18 Trainer coming back for the time being, especially with the strength of the 17 Trainer list and the consistency of the 17 Trainer list. Overall, I believe this metagame not only represents like the largest tournament scene, but also gives us a good idea to what you'll see in ranked regardless of your rank. And with that said, let's just go to top 64. It is in top 64 where the combination of play rate and win rate really comes together, as we see Giratina and Darkrai become 25% of the decks that made it into top cut, as well as the majority of top 5 being able to hold their ground. However, as expected, due to like their win rate in the past week, Charizard kind of fell off when it came to how many decks made the top cut. And personally, I think it's due to like how many people were actually playing it as to why we even see it in top cut, but maybe I'm just hating on Charizard. But also the numbers don't lie. Another thing that I wanted to note was that Rampardos and Gallade made up the same amount of top cut decks, although Rampardos being much less played overall, which could support my theory that it could be climbing alongside Gallade in a response to like Gyarados or most of the decks in the meta. However, Dialga Arceus does completely seem to have fallen off, especially not only in popularity but performance. Overall, top 64 is a good indicator of where like the popularity meets performance, as the stats in the chart basically show that a clearer picture of what decks make up the metagame after essentially weeding out like the extraneous or like the overrepresented decks that like aren't really cutting it. And now I want to jump to top 16 because that's where there was like a very drastic change from like what we're seeing right here. Top 16 is the first instance in which like the top spot is no longer Giratinas or Darkrai, despite not by much. Gyarados made up more of the top 16 than either the Giratina list with Darkrai or the one with Mewtwo, and I truly think this supports like my prediction that Gyarados will start to climb, and not necessarily in like performance. It's not like it's gonna win a whole bunch now all of a sudden, but it's definitely gonna be far more popular than like the 10% it keeps receiving week after week so far in Shining Revelry. And I truly believe like the following week is going to be a big representation on whether how strong Gyarados really is, or if it's just like a lack of counters, as for sure we're going to see more Hitmonlees, Gallades, like anything that like counters Gyarados, we're going to see more of it in the coming week. Other than that, like I think it's interesting to note that despite being like nowhere in the picture up to this point, we see a Palkia somehow make top 16, and I think it ended up losing in top 8, thus meaning it won its matchup in this round. And a deck that keeps lingering, although I have yet to mention, is, and you see it like in all the charts I've done so far, is the Greninja deck. It's a Greninja Darkrai that's actually playing one Giratina, and we will get into that list, but it's actually like kind of surprising to see how many of it was being played. So although it wasn't like a ridiculous number, it was seeing success, as I think 3 of them made the top 64. But it's one of those decks that's very interesting once you look at the numbers on like, I'm not sure how much was like a surprise factor or how easy it will be to like replicate this performance. Ultimately, the finals was against like both of the Giratina builds. One was the Darkrai, one was the Mewtwo. It was the Darkrai Giratina that came out on top with a W. But this week I want to do the meta report a little differently, as I will break down not only the top 3 decks, which in this case was the Darkrai Giratina, the Giratina with Mewtwo, and the Gyarados, but I also want to like pinpoint some of these other decks that made top 16 and see how, not only how they performed against like the main decks in the format, but how like realistic it is to like for you to pick up the deck and do well, or if we'll see like further success for them, or if it was like a one-off thing. So let's begin with the winning deck of Giratina with Darkrai. Here we have the winning deck list that essentially went undefeated throughout the entire tournament, as they didn't drop a game, and their 2 draws were actually intentional, as they started the tournament 6-0, so they were able to just like ID their way to the top cut. And then they, as being the winner means they didn't drop a single game in top cut. Not to say that they went 2-0 the entire time, but you know what I mean. Like they won their best of 3 all the way up to the victory. This list is essentially what Darkrai Giratina has evolved into. As you see, they've cut Drotagon. They're not playing Arceus. It's just focusing on their 4 Pokemon, their 2 EXs, and just crushing it. An interesting inclusion that I saw in this list that maybe more players start to adopt is like maxing out on all the healing / like health items. the 2 ladies, the 2 capes, and the 2 potions. And this kind of feeds off the same idea that the 17 trainer deck was doing with Mewtwo, as like the way to beat the mirror match or any Darkrai matchup is just to stay up in health and stay out of the range of a potential like lethal hit from your opponent. So whether they're going against Darkrai or against anything else, just continuously staying at full health or as high health as possible makes it where they survive or are more likely to survive hits, thus ultimately taking advantage or taking over through their own chip damage and lethal blows. As for their overall performance, aka like every single Darkrai Giratina list that was in this tournament, their overall record was basically 50%. Yeah, they won more than they lost, but the ties kind of like tanked down their win rate percentage. However, if you look closely at like, I listed like their total and then I put them against like the best decks in the format, or like the most popular decks in the format. And it's kind of telling like a different story. It's not as like uplifting or it's like, oh, it doesn't look like a deck that just won the tournament. As you see, like, yes, it has a win rate against the Mewtwo list, which is the second most popular deck, so it kind of makes sense that they see success. However, really poor against Gyarados, really poor into Meowscarada, and only 50-50 against Gallade. So although these numbers week to week don't necessarily mean anything is like set in stone, don't be surprised that despite the performance and the victory that they just had, if like the following week has Giratina Mewtwo trumping them and taking over the top spot, if not in popularity, at least in performance. And speaking of Mewtwo, let's jump into the second place list. Now, looking at the second place list, we have Mewtwo Giratina, which was also piloted by someone who was undefeated until the very end, as their only loss came in the finals. Despite the strength and popularity of the deck, I feel like the learning curve is much higher than that of Darkrai, and knowing where to allocate your energy is almost like dependent not only on matchups, but almost like turn to turn, game to game, depending on like the start that a deck has. There's times when if you just completely ramp up your Giratina, even though you could attack fast, then you don't really have something to back it up. So deciding when to just like chill and build up or when to be aggressive is something that you learn only through practice. So like somebody just first time picking up this deck might struggle at the beginning. So I do think that pays as to why like the Darkrai version, not only more popular, is tending to see more success. But I think as the format goes and more people get comfortable with this list, it will see better play. As far as the list goes, it's pretty standard at this point. A lot of people have like stuck to this version. The one change that happened from like what we saw in the first week was that they have decided to opt for like 1 Geo over like playing 2 reds, and that's mainly because of like the popularity of Meowscarada and decks like that this deck doesn't necessarily have a good matchup into. It lets you hit certain ranges that you couldn't hit otherwise, like being able to hit 60 with your Mewtwo or 160 is a game changer, especially in matchups like Meowscarada, where Meowscarada is either hovering at like a 60 HP Sprigatito, or however you pronounce it, or Meowscarada with the cape is sitting at 160, and this deck can't hit it with the red because it's not an EX. The Geo lets you get there with the Mewtwo. As for the overall win rate, this deck is hovering similar to the Darkrai, and like, although this one's just under 50%. However, it does, as you can see down below, have a much better balance of records throughout like the top decks in the format. And through my own reflection and prediction of what I believe is going to happen in the next week, I do believe this deck will be far more successful than the Darkrai variant, due to my anticipation of a rise in Gyarados and Gallade, which are 2 decks that the Darkrai version kind of struggles like mightily with, while Mewtwo not only has a better matchup against Gyarados, but crushes the Gallade due to the typing. So although, again, like I said, it's not set in stone, don't be surprised if that's the outcome of the following tournament. Third and fourth place were both Gyarados, and I truly believe Gyarados' takeover in top 16 was no fluke, as this deck is very likely to skyrocket in popularity after this weekend, as it's both effective and its playstyle is very user-friendly, as its core is just to build up a big guy and swing with the big guy. And don't get me wrong, I'm very well that there's nuances to certain matchups, like when it comes to playing against a fighting deck, how you might want to lead with Magikarp to avoid him only being able to snipe you. And as far as the list goes, it's pretty common now to just play the 1 Origin form Palkia alongside your 2/2 of Manaphy and Gyarados line. And something I didn't see in the third place list that's definitely gained more popularity in like the ranked ladder is the use of Cape, as the extra 20 HP makes it where like the best deck, which in this case is the Darkrai Giratina, unable to like get rid of your Gyarados regardless of the setup. Even if they're able to like charge Darkrai into a Giratina attack, it's very hard for them to take you out. And as for the total win rate, Gyarados by far had the best. As you can see them sitting at a 53% win rate, as they were able to crush not only the most popular deck in the room, Giratina Darkrai, but completely crush the best or the most commonly used anti-meta deck, as they went 23-5 against Meowscarada Beedrill. Add on top of that, it basically holds its own against the Mewtwo Giratina version. As you saw, it went 50-50. Put it in a prime position to succeed, as though it still had a terrible matchup against Gallade. Gallade's popularity being so low was almost like a non-factor in these Gyarados' climb to victory. Now starting with honorable mentions, aka like decks that made it to top 16 or better more or less and caught my eye, we had the Meowscarada Beedrill that really took over the anti-meta crown. This was by far the best performing version of it, with the 1-1-1 line of Beedrill. As we look at their win rate, it comes to no surprise how this list got so far, but at the same time we can see why it failed to capitalize, as it has some of the most polarizing stats. It completely crushes the best deck, and it has a very good matchup against the second best deck. However, the rest of the field just completely like crushes Meowscarada, at least this version. Plus, this is the type of deck that could like has the potential to completely dominate a top cut if all it sees is like round after round of Darkrai. But it could come crashing down at any moment once it finds like a Gyarados matchup or a Gallade that, for more often than not, will beat you. All this to say that Meowscarada isn't going anywhere in terms of like its play rate in the format, but I don't really see it having a much higher ceiling than where it's at right now, because it's very matchup dependent, as like if you go against a certain matchup, you'll win all your games, and if you go against another matchup, you won't win any. So it's like that kind of like toss and turn, which is what leads to like you'll see a tournament where it's basically a finish in the top 4, gets second place, or it might even win if it goes through an entire top cut of just facing like the best matchup it has. Or you can see its runs die early in like top 32 or top 16 due to just facing like a Gyarados. As promised, we finally acknowledged the Darkrai Greninja list that finished top 8 in this event. However, I'm going to be fully transparent, as clear as the game plan may seem, as you essentially sit behind a Druddigon while building up Darkrai, Giratina, and evolving into a Greninja. This is a deck that the numbers just don't add up for me. As you can see, it had a very good win rate of 52%. However, it was so poor against like the top decks in the format that I'm not even aware how they like found success. And I'd be surprised of any player that is able to like replicate the success that the player using this list alongside, like I think it was a total of 3 players that made top 16, or I mean top 64 with Darkrai Greninja similar to this, if not card for card. And I'd be surprised, like I said, if we see somebody else replicate this in the coming weeks. Not because the deck is bad, essentially, it's just when you just look at the numbers, it went 6-16 against the best deck, 9-13 against the second best deck. It just evened out with Gyarados and got crushed by Meowscarada. So like, what were they beating? It's something that if I was able to talk to the player that used this, or I guess it might have been even a team that was on this deck, I would love to hear their thoughts. As like somebody from the outside looking in, I feel bad like trying to describe this or explain this when I certainly don't get it. But it was like my, I guess, due diligence of like, if I'm reporting on like top decks or interesting decks, this had to be on the list. I just don't have words for it, if I'm being honest. And the final entry of this meta report goes to Palkia Manaphy, as it was definitely a deck that was seeing a lot more play pre-Shining Revelry, but has since fallen out of favor. It is essentially the Gyarados list, but literally just swap out Gyarados for Palkia EX. And as for win rates, this list does have the smallest sample size due to like lack of like players, so take the results with like a grain of salt. But it clearly had a very good matchup against the Giratina Darkrai list, and it doesn't have like the glaring weakness that Gyarados has against Gallade. But it was essentially not able to keep up with decks such as like the Mewtwo Giratina or Gyarados. So ultimately, congrats to the player for having such a great run with a list like this. And it'll definitely increase the amount of people that will give Palkia a try, as they saw like, oh, this guy got top 8. Maybe it's like the key to winning. Personally, I don't believe we'll be seeing too much Palkia make much of a dent in the current metagame, other than like a one-off top like this one. That concludes my meta report for the second weekend of Shining Revelry. This video is essentially a day late, as the Palma drop event video kind of like took priority in my posting schedule. But I do hope y'all enjoyed the meta report, as I enjoy making them. I usually never ask for this, but if you truly enjoyed it and have made it this far into the video, please consider like sharing it with your friends or anybody you know, as well as give me feedback on how to improve this style of video. Otherwise, as always, if you enjoy videos like these or all things Pokemon Pocket, please consider liking and subscribing, and above all else, stay pro.